Welcome to our deep dive into Gnosticism.
Yeah, Gnosticism.
It's a fascinating and often misunderstood corner of early Christianity.
Yeah.
You've shared some really interesting sources on this topic,
Mhm.
and I'm curious to explore how these alternative views of Christ differ from what became the Orthodox Christian tradition.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially since we have a background in philosophy of religion, we can really get into some of the deeper implications of these ideas,
Exactly.
both philosophically and psychologically.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this idea that before the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE,
Right.
there wasn't just one version of Christianity.
Yeah.
There were so many different ideas floating around about who Christ was,
Right.
what his message meant,
Mm.
and even the nature of God itself.
Yeah, that's right. Before Nicaea, there was a lot of diversity of thought in early Christianity. Different groups had their own interpretations and understandings.
Right.
And it was really at Nicaea that the early church started to define what would become Orthodox doctrine.
Right, and in that process,
Yeah.
some beliefs, like Arianism and Gnosticism,
Right.
got labeled as heresies,
Exactly.
almost like a what-if scenario for the history of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
What if some of these other views had gained more traction?
Yeah.
How would that have changed the course of Western thought?
It's a great way to think about like a thought experiment almost,
Yeah,
to explore these alternative paths and see where they might have led.
exactly.
So to start unpacking this, I think it's helpful to look at Arianism first.
Okay.
This was a major theological challenge to the idea of the Trinity,
Right, the Trinity.
which is, of course, one of the core doctrines of Orthodox Christianity.
Right, and for our listeners who might need a refresher,
Yeah.
the Trinity is the belief that God is one being existing in three persons: the Father, the Son, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
Now, where did Arianism fit into all of this?
Well, Arianism really focused on preserving God's absolute oneness,
Okay.
his unity.
Hmm.
Arius, the theologian behind this movement, was concerned that the idea of Christ being equal to God,
As the Trinity suggests, seemed like it was introducing multiple gods.
okay,
And that really contradicted the fundamental monotheism
right.
of both Judaism and Christianity.
I see. So how did Arius try to resolve this?
Well, he proposed that Christ the Son, or Logos, was created by God the Father.
Hmm.
This meant that Christ was divine, incredibly powerful and important,
Right.
but not equal to the Father.
Okay.
To make this distinction even clearer,
Yeah.
Arius used the Greek term homoousios to describe Christ,
Bromosio.
which means similar in substance to God.
Okay.
This was different from homoousios, the
Yeah.
term that would later be adopted at Nicaea
Hmm.
to describe Christ as being of the same substance as God.
That's a really subtle but significant distinction.
Yeah, it is.
And I can see how, for someone trying to grapple with the complexities of the Trinity,
Right.
Arius's view might have seemed more straightforward.
It's definitely a simpler explanation in a way.
Yeah.
It kind of cuts through some of the theological knots. Right. But of course, it caused a major theological rift.
Oh, absolutely. It was a huge debate
Yeah.
with passionate arguments on both sides.
And this is where I think it gets even more interesting.
Yeah.
And this is where your interest in the philosophical and psychological aspects really comes in.
Exactly.
We can look at Arianism through the lens of Carl Jung's work in analytical psychology.
Right. Jung offers a really fascinating perspective on these early Christian debates.
All right, Jung and early Christianity, that's not a connection you hear every day.
It's not a typical pairing, I'll grant you that.
So tell me more about this connection.
Well, Jung had this concept of the individuation process,
Okay.
which is the journey we all take toward wholeness, toward integrating all the different parts of ourselves.
Hmm.
And he also talked about the shadow,
Yeah.
which are those aspects of ourselves often negative or uncomfortable
Right.
that we tend to repress or deny.
So how does Arianism connect to these Jungian ideas about individuation and the shadow?
Well, think about Arius's view of Christ. Christ wasn't originally equal to God,
Right.
but he became more divine through his actions, his suffering,
Mhm.
and ultimately his sacrifice.
Oh.
It's like Christ went through his own version of individuation,
Right.
a journey toward a kind of divinity.
And that resonates with our own human desire for growth,
Yeah,
for becoming better versions of ourselves.
exactly.
It's not that we are literally trying to become divine,
Right.
but we are all on this journey of integrating different parts of ourselves,
Yeah.
facing our shadows, and striving for a more complete and whole sense of self.
I think that's a really insightful connection.
Yeah.
And it's why Arianism, even though it was deemed a heresy,
Right.
can still speak to us on a psychological level.
Right. It reflects these deep human longings
Exactly.
that are still so relevant today.
Absolutely. But it also raises a really interesting question.
Yeah.
What if Arianism represents a part of the early church's own shadow, a set of beliefs that were too uncomfortable or challenging to be fully integrated into the official doctrine?
That's a thought-provoking idea.
It is, isn't it?
So these heresies might not just be theological errors,
Right.
but they could also point to those hidden or repressed aspects of a belief system,
Exactly.
those parts that are difficult to reconcile with a dominant narrative.
Yeah, it's like looking at the underside of a tapestry, exploring the knots and loose threads that hold the whole thing together.
That's a great analogy.
It reminds us that history,
Right.
especially religious history, is never as neat and tidy as it might appear in textbooks.
Absolutely.
There are always these alternative voices,
Mhm.
these different ways of understanding the world.
Right.
And those voices, even if they were silenced or marginalized,
Yeah.
can still offer us valuable insights.
So we've explored Arianism and its potential connections to Jungian psychology.
Right.
Now let's dive into the wider world of Gnosticism.
Yeah, let's do that.
From what I understand, Gnostics had a whole different set of beliefs about Christ, salvation,
Yes.
and even the nature of reality itself.
Absolutely. Gnosticism was quite diverse.
Okay.
But we can start by looking at two groups
Right.
that held radically different views from both each other and from what became Orthodox Christianity,
Okay.
the Marcionites and the Ebionites.
Marcionites and Ebionites.
These are great examples
Right.
because they show just how much variety there was in early Christian thought.
All right, so Marcionites and Ebionites.
Yeah.
What made their views of Christ so different?
Well, first you have the Marcionites.
Okay.
They actually believed in two gods.
Hugots.
Yeah, one was the God of the Old Testament,
Okay.
who they saw as flawed and responsible for creating this imperfect material world. The other was the God revealed through Christ,
Right.
who was purely divine, a being of pure spirit.
Okay.
They even believed that Christ's physical body was just an illusion.
Whoa. A two-God system and a phantom Jesus.
Yeah, pretty radical stuff, right?
That's a long way from the Orthodox Christian view of a single God and the incarnation of Christ as both fully human and fully divine.
Yeah, it really challenges those fundamental doctrines.
What about the Ebionites? How do they see Christ?
The Ebionites were different. They stuck with the standard monotheism,
Okay.
one God and one God only.
Hmm.
But for them, Jesus was entirely human,
Okay.
not divine at all.
Interesting.
They believed he was chosen by God and then adopted as his son after his death and resurrection.
So we have the Marcionites saying Christ was all spirit and no flesh,
Right.
and the Ebionites saying he was all flesh and no spirit.
Exactly opposite ends of the spectrum.
It sounds like they were grappling with the same fundamental questions
Yeah, I think you're right.
about the nature of the divine and the relationship between the spiritual and the material.
Absolutely. Those were central questions for all these early Christian groups.
But they arrived at completely opposite conclusions.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
It really is.
How different groups could interpret the same basic ideas in such radically different ways.
And both of these views offer fascinating insights
Yeah.
into the philosophical and psychological landscape of early Christianity.
We'll get into those deeper implications in a bit.
Okay.
But first, I think it's important to emphasize that these were just two examples among many.
Right.
There was a whole spectrum of Gnostic beliefs and practices. And it wasn't until later that the church, through councils like Nicaea, started to solidify a single unified doctrine.
So before Nicaea, it was almost like a choose-your-own-adventure version of Christianity.
Exactly. There were all these different paths you could take.
Wow.
And I think exploring those alternative paths can really help us understand the development of Christian thought
Yeah.
in a much more nuanced way.
I completely agree. All right, now that we have a better understanding of the landscape,
Yeah.
let's delve into the philosophical and psychological implications of these different Gnostic views.
Let's do it.
So let's connect these different Gnostic Christologies
Yeah.
back to some of those big philosophical questions
Yeah.
about the human condition.
Okay.
It seems like they offer very different perspectives on what it means to be human, the relationship between body and soul,
Yeah.
and even the nature of reality itself.
Absolutely.
So where should we start?
Well, let's start with the Marcionites
Yeah.
and their belief in a purely divine Christ
Right.
who only appeared to have a physical body.
Hmm.
Their view reflects a really deep distrust of the material world.
Okay.
They saw the physical body as a kind of prison.
A prison.
Yeah, something that trapped the soul
Mm.
and kept it from experiencing true spiritual liberation.
So for them, salvation wasn't about transforming the world or even improving oneself morally.
No.
It was about escaping the material realm altogether
Right.
and reuniting with the divine realm of pure spirit.
Exactly.
Okay.
They believed that the material world was inherently flawed, created by a lesser, imperfect God.
So because they saw Christ as purely spiritual,
Right.
his suffering and death on the cross couldn't have been literal.
No, it had to be symbolic.
That's a pretty radical departure from the Orthodox Christian understanding
It is a very different interpretation.
of the incarnation and the atonement.
It really challenges those core doctrines.
But it does make you think about how different cultures and philosophies
Yeah.
view the relationship between the spiritual and the material.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting from a psychological perspective as well.
Oh, how so?
This Marcionite idea of the body as a prison,
Right.
something to be escaped from,
Okay.
it resonates with certain ascetic traditions that you find not just in Christianity, but also in other religions and philosophies.
Okay.
It speaks to this deep human desire
Yeah.
to transcend our limitations,
Okay.
to break free from the constraints of the physical world.
I can see how that idea would be appealing.
Yeah.
Especially in times of suffering.
Right.
Or when facing the inevitability of death.
Exactly. It offers a kind of hope.
Yeah.
A way to imagine something beyond the pain and limitations of our physical existence.
But what about the Ebionites?
Yeah, the Ebionites.
They seem to have a more positive view of the material world.
Yes. The Ebionites offer a stark contrast.
Okay.
Remember, they believed that Jesus was fully human,
Right.
not divine in any inherent way.
Okay.
He became the Son of God through his righteous actions and his obedience to God's will.
So this view really elevates the human potential.
Yeah, it does.
If Jesus, a human being, could achieve such a high spiritual status, then maybe we can too.
That's the implication, right?
Yeah.
That we all have this potential for spiritual greatness within us.
So instead of seeing the body as a limitation,
Right.
they saw it as a potential vehicle
Yeah,
for spiritual growth and transformation.
exactly.
It's almost like they were saying that holiness is something you achieve through your actions in the world, not by escaping from it.
Precisely. And this aligns with a different philosophical perspective.
Oh.
One that emphasizes the importance of embodied experience and the role of human agency in our spiritual development.
So we're not just souls trapped in bodies,
Right.
but rather our physical existence
Right.
is an integral part of who we are and how we connect with the divine.
It's a more holistic view of the human experience.
This makes me think of Aristotle
Oh, yeah, good connection.
and his emphasis on virtue ethics. The idea that we cultivate virtue through practice,
Right.
through living a good life in the material world.
It's about integrating our physical and spiritual selves.
Right.
Not denying or rejecting one or the other.
It's not about denying our physical nature,
Exactly.
but about integrating it into a holistic understanding of what it means to be human.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
And it shows how these early Christian debates about the nature of Christ
Right.
were also engaging with broader philosophical questions that have been pondered for centuries.
Like what?
Questions about the relationship between mind and body,
Okay.
the nature of reality,
Right.
and the meaning of human existence.
Big questions.
Yeah, the really big ones.
It's fascinating to see how these ideas are all woven together.
It is, isn't it?
Now, I know we talked earlier about using Carl Jung's framework
Right.
to understand Arianism, but can we also apply his ideas to Gnosticism more broadly?
Absolutely.
Yep.
In fact, Jung was deeply interested in Gnosticism. He saw Gnostic symbols and myths
Yeah.
not as literal truths, but as representations of universal psychological processes
Yeah.
that are at play within each of us.
So he's not interested in the historical accuracy or the theological details.
No, not so much.
He's looking for something deeper,
Right.
something that speaks to the human psyche.
Exactly. He believed that these symbols could offer us a way to understand the workings of our own minds,
Okay.
particularly the unconscious aspects of ourselves.
You keep mentioning archetypes.
Yeah.
But to be honest, I'm a bit fuzzy on what they are
Okay.
and how they relate to Gnosticism.
Sure, I can break that down for you. Jung's concept of the archetype is complex.
Right.
But in simple terms, archetypes are these universal, recurring, patterns of thought,
Huh?
imagery, and behavior
Okay.
that are found across cultures and throughout history.
So they are not learned,
No.
but rather something that is innate,
Right.
part of our shared human heritage.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that many of the key figures and symbols in Gnostic texts
Okay.
align with Jungian archetypes.
Oh, really? Give me an example.
For example, the serpent,
Okay.
which is often associated with temptation and deceit in the Judeo-Christian tradition.
Right. The serpent in the Garden of Eden?
Yeah, exactly that one.
Okay.
But in Gnosticism,
Yeah.
the serpent takes on a very different meaning.
I remember that in some Gnostic texts, the serpent is associated with knowledge
Yeah,
and even enlightenment.
Exactly. And for Jung, the serpent often represents those hidden instinctual forces within us, those aspects of ourselves that we may fear or repress. But that ultimately holds the potential for transformation and growth.
It's connected to the shadow,
Yes.
that part of us that we often try to deny.
Mm-hmm.
But that can be a source of great power and insight
Right.
if we are willing to confront it.
It's about facing those darker parts of ourselves
Yeah.
and integrating them into a more whole and authentic sense of self.
So through this Jungian lens, the serpent in Gnostic texts becomes more than just a literal figure.
Right.
It becomes a symbol for a psychological process,
Exactly.
for the journey of confronting our shadows and integrating them into a more whole and authentic sense of self.
Yeah, it's a powerful symbol of transformation.
And it's not just the serpent, right?
No, there are other examples too.
Like what?
Sophia, a key figure in Gnostic thought,
Okay.
represents wisdom and the divine feminine. Jung saw her as an archetype of the anima,
Yeah.
feminine principle within the male psyche.
Okay.
And the demiurge, the flawed creator figure in Gnosticism, can be seen as representing an inflated ego,
Inflated ego.
that part of ourselves that can become disconnected from the divine
Okay.
and create a world of illusion and suffering.
Wow. This is all really starting to come together.
It is, isn't it?
So when we look at these Gnostic texts through a Jungian lens,
Yeah.
they become less about historical events or theological doctrines,
Right.
and more about the inner workings of the human psyche.
That's what makes them so relevant today.
Ah.
Even for people who aren't religious
Right.
or who might not be interested in the historical details of early Christianity.
Okay.
These symbols and myths are tapping into something universal.
Yeah.
Something that speaks to the human condition, regardless of your beliefs or background.
I'm starting to see Gnosticism in a whole new light.
Yeah.
It's like it offers us a language to talk about those deep existential questions that we all wrestle with.
Exactly.
The nature of good and evil, the meaning of suffering, the search for truth and meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and confusing.
You're getting it.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty of exploring these alternative perspectives. They challenge us to think differently,
Sure.
to question our assumptions,
Right.
and to expand our understanding of what's possible.
All right, so we've unpacked a lot about Gnosticism.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
Its various views of Christ,
Mhm.
its philosophical implications,
Mhm.
and its connections to Jungian psychology.
Right.
But there's still one more big question I want to explore.
Okay, what's that?
What did Jung have to say about the archetype of Christ himself?
That's a great question. And it's something that Jung dedicated a lot of thought to. He saw Christ as one of the most powerful and enduring archetypes in human history,
Okay.
representing
The self.
the self.
Okay.
And again, this isn't about a literal interpretation of Christ's divinity.
Right.
Instead, Jung is using self to refer to the totality of who we are,
Okay.
the potential for wholeness that exists within each of us.
So instead of focusing on those theological debates about Christ's nature,
Right.
Jung is looking at the figure of Christ as a representation of something fundamental
Yeah.
about the human psyche.
Exactly. He saw Christ as embodying this process of individuation, this journey toward integrating our conscious and unconscious selves.
Okay.
He saw the story of Christ as a symbolic representation of the path we all must take
Right.
to become whole, to confront our shadows, and to unite those disparate parts of ourselves into a unified being.
It's like Christ becomes a model for our own psychological and spiritual development.
Yeah, That's a good way to put it.
Not in the sense that we are trying to become Christ literally,
Right.
but in the sense that his story illuminates the path of transformation
Exactly.
that is available to each of us.
And that's what makes Jung's interpretation so compelling,
Wow.
even for someone who might not be traditionally religious.
Right.
It offers a way to connect with these profound spiritual ideas without necessarily subscribing to a specific dogma or belief system.
Okay.
It's about recognizing those universal patterns of human experience
Right.
that are reflected in these ancient myths and symbols.
I'm starting to see how Gnosticism, through this Jungian lens, can be seen as a kind of psychological roadmap.
Yeah, I like that. A roadmap.
It's not about escaping the world or rejecting the material,
No.
but rather about using these symbols and stories as tools
Right.
for self-discovery and transformation.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And I think that's why these ideas continue to resonate with people today, even centuries after they were first articulated.
Right.
They speak to something so fundamental about the human condition.
Yeah.
This longing for wholeness,
Right.
for meaning, for connection to something greater than ourselves.
It's amazing to think that these heresies,
Yeah.
these alternative views of Christ that were rejected by the early church,
Right.
might actually hold valuable insights for us today.
They do. They really do.
It makes me wonder what other hidden treasures we might uncover
Yeah.
if we are willing to look beyond the official narratives and explore those less traveled paths.
That's the beauty of intellectual curiosity and exploration. And I
Right.
think that's one of the key takeaways from our deep dive into Gnostic Christianity.
Okay.
It challenges us to question our assumptions,
Right.
to be open to different perspectives, and to recognize that truth is often multifaceted and complex.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
what would you say is the most important thing for our listener to remember about Gnosticism and its relevance to their own life?
I think the most important thing is to remember that these Gnostic ideas, even though they were labeled as heresies, weren't just abstract theological debates.
No, they were about real human struggles.
Right.
They were grappling with the same fundamental questions that humans have been asking for centuries.
Yeah, like what?
Who are we? What is our purpose? What is the nature of reality?
Right.
And how do we live a meaningful life?
So it's not about agreeing or disagreeing with specific Gnostic doctrines.
Right.
It's about using them as a starting point for our own exploration,
Exactly.
for our own journey of self-discovery and meaning-making.
And remember that Jungian lens we've been using.
Right.
Those Gnostic symbols, those stories of Christ and Sophia and the Demiurge can help us understand our own inner world. Those hidden depths of the psyche that we often ignore or repress.
Right. It's like Gnosticism through Jung becomes a kind of psychological mirror.
Yeah.
Reflecting back to us those parts of ourselves that we need to integrate in order to become whole.
Well said.
So we've journeyed through some pretty mind-bending territory today.
We have.
Arianism, questioning the Trinity Gnosticism, offering a whole spectrum of Christs. And Jung seeing it all through a psychological lens.
It's been quite a journey.
He's been quite a ride.
And I hope it's been a thought-provoking one for our listener. Absolutely.
But before we go,
Yeah.
let's leave our listener with a final question to ponder.
Okay.
What resonates most with you from this exploration of Gnostic Christianity? What will you take away and continue to explore on your own?
Until next time, keep seeking.
And happy diving.